Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are surviving the tsunami of big money. Okay. Also, we've been abandoned to endless COVID by our government. And finally, we must oppose Israel's very big gamble. So those are our three topics. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's particularly important this evening because I mistakenly originally scheduled this show for 9 o'clock. Only noticed it a few minutes ago and changed the time to 8 p.m. So some people may still be thinking that I was going on at 9 p.m. Anyway, thank you for coming. I see some people here, but no one has said hello in the comments yet, which means probably the people who are here are from Twitter. Anyway, the first of our pieces for tonight is from the Hartman Report, Tom Hartman, that is. It's called Will Democracy Survive the Tsunami of Right-Wing Dark Money Coming This Fall? Subtitle, If Democrats, or tagline I should say, if Democrats survive the onslaught that's coming and emerge victorious at the federal level, the first order of business next year must be to strip the cancer of dark money out of our body politic. I would change that to say, strip the cancer of big money out of our body politics. Because the money going to super PACs is not necessarily dark. They must account for contributions above $200. It's those contributions that count for the big super PACs. Here's an interesting graphic of a tsunami of money, which is about to deluge the United States. Very well done graphic. Then there was evidently a song inspired by this article. That's available somewhere. And Tom's reading of this article as an audio podcast is available also, and there's a link to that. But I'm going to read the article myself and do commentary at the same time. It begins, get ready. Massive pools of dark right-wing money are soon going to clobber us. Will democracy survive this onslaught by the morbidly rich? Democrats are giddy right now. The substantial lead that Trump had held over Biden for months has largely vanished as the matchup has changed to Harris and Walz. In the 10 polls aggregated by Real Clear Politics since Biden's withdrawal, Trump has lost 3 points and only leads by 1. In the Daily Kos Civics poll, Harris leads Trump 49 to 45. Reuters put the race at 43-42, and Morning Consult has it at 47-46. All with Harris in the lead, I believe. Trump is blustering in ways that indicate he thinks he's losing. Yesterday's presser, and remember this was published on August 9th, so yesterday's presser was August 8th, at his shabby golf motel was particularly pathetic. while J.D. Vance's poll numbers are in the toilet or the couch and showing no indication of recovery any day soon. That said, other lessons from this and recent past years should keep Democrats from easing up or becoming overconfident. The official beginning of the election season is still almost a month away, and the big money pledged by right wing and neo fascist billionaires hasn't even shown up yet. While over 100 million pissed off women and the widespread concern that Trump and the GOP are determined to destroy the American system of government seems like a powerful force, history tells us big dark money could overcome even those substantial tailwinds. We saw this played out here in Portland just last month. Sushila Jayapal, sister of Pramila, was a well thought of and successful Oregon politician, a Multnomah County commissioner, the county that includes the Portland metro area. She had a long list of great accomplishments, was well liked, and was a shoo-in to replace retiring Democratic Congressman Earl Blumenauer. Until AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, came into our district and dropped millions into the race with a deeply dishonest smear campaign. I was getting a large 4-color hit piece flyer about every 3 days in my mailbox. Local radio and TV was saturated with the ads that essentially portrayed her as either evil or incompetent or both. And right up until the election, nobody knew that AIPAC was funding the campaign. They'd set up a front group and carefully timed its incorporation so it didn't have to disclose its funder until after the election was over. So in that sense, of course, the money was dark. As Jayapal noted, the day after it was announced that she'd lost the election, quote, "This race showed so clearly why we need to have real campaign finance reform. Outside super PACs came in and spent an unprecedented $6 million, even timing their contributions so that they wouldn't have to show who was trying to buy this election until well after the votes were cast. AIPAC also reportedly spent more than $14 million to take down New York's Jamal Bowman, and just this week knocked out Missouri Congresswoman and squad member Cori Bush with $8 million. As the pro-Israel PAC notes on their homepage, big money dropped into a race in the last week's works. Quote, 98% of AIPAC-backed candidates won their general election races in 2022, unquote. But AIPAC is a piker compared to what's going to be coming down the road as the tech, banking, insurance, and fossil fuel billionaires and their companies weigh into the presidential race this fall. A previous campaign by the fossil fuel industry is instructive, particularly since that industry sees Kamala Harris, and Tim Walz as enemies. Harris signed off on the largest climate legislation in world history, and Walz has required the utilities in Minnesota to be 100% carbon-free by 2040, a mere 16 years from now. 2018, Washington Governor Jay Inslee got initiative 1631 on the ballot. It was a modest carbon tax with a rebate attached so drivers wouldn't be penalized. It was widely popular when it was rolled out, and everybody in the region was excited that Washington State was about to blaze a new climate-friendly path, an example for every state in the Union. That was until the fossil fuel industry weighed in just weeks before the election dropping 17 million into what many called a hugely dishonest and frightening. They claimed the tax would destroy the state's economy advertising campaign that blanketed the state. The ballot measure, previously seen as inevitable, was destroyed at the polls. This is the brave new world Clarence Thomas tie-breaking vote brought America when the Supreme Court, in their 2010 Citizens United decision, legalized both political bribery and massive intervention in elections by corporations and billionaires. Prior to Thomas's vote on that decision, Harlan Crow, who helped finance the original Swift boat attacks on John Kerry in 2004, and other billionaires, had lavished millions on him and his family. Crow gave the group, Thomas' wife, by Jenny, started $500,000. He bought Thomas' mother's home and others in the neighborhood so she could live rent-free for the rest of her life. He put Thomas' nephew through an expensive prep school. But yet another billionaire bought Thomas a $250,000 luxury recreational vehicle, RV. It was a remarkably successful investment for Crow, his family, and his billionaire buddies. Just his own family's contribution went from an average of a few $1,000s a year during the decade preceding 2010 to multiple millions every year after Thomas' vote. Americans for Tax Fairness calculated it at an 862% increase just for the Crow family. Wow. Look at that increase starting in 2010, how big it was in 2012, 2016, 2020, and 2022. In this post-Citizens United era, truth has become a casualty of the big money. For example, according to OpenSecrets.org, the Empower Parents PAC has contributed $82.5 million. Susquehanna International Group, $69.7 million. Citadel LLC, $59.9 million, and Uline Inc., $59.6 million to Republican causes so far. And they're just getting started. What is that? Let's see, 150 million, 210 million. That's about 270 million we're talking about. Ever since Citizens United was legalized, literally unlimited contributions to the new category of political action committees it created, super PACs. Just in the 15 months from January 2023 to April of 2024, over 8.6 million has been raised for this year's federal campaigns, with over 65% of that money, 5.6 billion, running through PACs. And as noted, they're just getting started. Governor Inslee was confident his carbon tax was going to pass, just like Jayapal, Bowman, and Bush expected a comfortable ride to re-election. Then big money came in and lowered the boom. So get ready. It's going to get ugly. There's not a competitive House or Senate race anywhere in America that's immune for massive dark money that's been thrown together at the last minute to remain untraceable. And the presidential race will be unlike anything ever seen before. Already a South African immigrant billionaire, I believe that's Elon Musk, has promulgated a deep fake video of Harris calling herself a DEI hire, while J.D. Vance is trying to swift boat Tim Walz. To compound the problem, Republicans on the Federal Election Committee just announced they will prevent that agency from regulating deep fakes in this presidential election. And Wisconsin dark right-wing money is attempting to reshape that state's form of governance to give more power to Republicans in its in the legislature. Did I mention they're just getting started? You won't even know the dimensions of the coming onslaught until it's upon us in September and October. As Senator Elizabeth Warren noted, echoing a position held by fully 72% of American voters, quote, our democracy shouldn't be bought and paid for by the wealthy and powerful, unquote. Well, of course, I've tried over the last 2 years now, close to 2 years, to organize a campaign called Dump the Corruption to get people to vote against those who are getting big money in campaigns. That has never caught on. Had it caught on, we would not be plagued by the big money now. If Democrats survive the onslaught that's coming and emerge victorious at the federal level, the first order of business next year must be to strip the cancer of dark money out of our body politic. We can't take anything for granted. We must phone bank, canvass, write postcards, talk to friends and neighbors, help people register to vote, and share the good word. And once again, I think the good word here has to be that we're supposed to have a democracy where people are not supposed to be represented by people who have been bought by big money. So what everybody must do is to vote against the big money by following a particular rule, which I will show in just a minute. We can't take anything for granted. We must, sorry, I shared that already. Going on to the final paragraph, if we fail, the poison Thomas and his Republican colleagues on the court have injected into our democracy may well prove fatal to our system of government, signaling an end to the American experiment and the beginning of a full-blown oligarchy. Of course, I couldn't agree more. And what I'll do now is to share the anti-oligarchy rule, which if you are regular watchers here, you have seen many times before. It's a simple meme. Vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corps, individuals, PACs, or party committees, and who repudiate all super PAC support. So that is the rule. It's very simple. It calls on people to vote against other people, but leaves them free to vote for people who are not taking the big money. I'm not trying to dictate here the choice that people should have of people who are not taking the big money. That choice is up to them. I am not advocating for a particular candidate. I am advocating who needs to be defeated. And again, it's every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corps, from individuals, from PACs or party committees, and who will repudiate all super PAC support. So let's move on to our next piece here. Well, before I forget, I should share this one before I move on. There we go. A lot of shares, a lot of attendance on Facebook tonight. Not sure why. This was shared by many, many people, but okay. So a lot of shares tonight. I'm going to share it myself. Okay, Evelina leaves a comment. Hello, wondering if there is a list of those who do not take big PAC money. Uh, no, but there is a list, okay, of those who do take big money, whether it's PAC or not PAC money. And that list is given by everyone in the Congress. Just get a list of all the representatives in the House of Representatives and all the senators. And everyone in the Senate right now and in the Congress right now are taking big money from someone. If it's not from PACs, it's from rich folks. If it's not from rich folks, it's from super PACs. That makes it easy. You only vote for people who were funded by small dollar contributions of 200, okay, or less. So thank you, Evelina, for asking that question and allowing me to give the answer. I'm going to share the screen now for a piece from Truth Out. Sorry. I said Tooth Out from Truth Out. My tongue is a little tied here tonight, more than usual. But here we go. So the title of this piece is the U.S. government has abandoned us to endless COVID. We can do better. The pandemic isn't over. Why is it so hard to get accurate information about it? Or he says to find accurate information. The author is October Krausch. I don't know if October is male or female. It's from Truth Out, August 10th, 2024. This is part of the series, Despair and Disparity, the Uneven Burdens of COVID-19. This week, Nassau County, New York passed a mask ban. Those wearing face masks will now face the possibility of up to a year in jail or a $1,000 fine. Angry at the power of anti-genocide protests, lawmakers banned one of the most basic forms of disease protection, just as the world is experiencing a record surge in COVID cases. While officials insist that the law will not be used against those masking for medical reasons, Disabled activists protesting the move say they were intentionally coughed on during the city council meeting where the bill was passed. In a world of airborne contagious diseases, everyone has a medical reason for masking. So why doesn't our public health policy recognize that? In 2020, at the height of the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, then President Donald Trump was excoriated for saying that, quote, when you test, you create more cases, unquote. This statement was met with outcry by journalists and public health professionals and pundits from all major outlets. Trump's statements and policies on COVID were regularly and widely critiqued. In October 2023, CNN launched a tracker of, quote, every time Trump said that the coronavirus pandemic was over, but it wasn't, unquote, which juxtaposed Trump's words with the number of new cases in the United States. Since President Joe Biden took office, many of the same things that Trump was excoriated for have been implemented as policy. December 2022, Biden suddenly declared the pandemic over at the Detroit Auto Show. And in May 2023, Congress ended the federal emergency. Both moves were unrelated to any data about case numbers. Yet no similar media outcry about premature or imaginary declarations has dogged the Biden administration. Trump's outrageous argument that if the U.S. has collected less data, the picture would be rosier has been made into official policy under the Biden administration. As of May 1st, 2024, hospitals are no longer required to report admissions, and most of the other data collection infrastructure on COVID test rates, like local dashboards and easily readable trackers on cases and deaths, has already disappeared. By mid-July 2024, it was possible for Biden to have an active case of COVID and to claim that he is going home to isolate while simultaneously appearing on video in a group of people unmasked, without major media outlets blinking an eye about this contradiction. At this point in the pandemic, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC website, is no longer a go-to place for clear COVID information, but instead muddies the difference between COVID and the common cold and its prevention recommendations. As Caroline Hugh, an epidemiologist who volunteers for the Public Health Collective, told Truth Out, it's hard to know what's going on because the, quote, picture has gotten a lot fuzzier and more complicated. As supports for COVID sunset, access is obstructed. It is worth stating explicitly that the COVID pandemic is decidedly not over despite the end of the U.S. federal emergency. The policy and response have changed without any real relationship to changes in the illness and how it affects people. The basic facts about COVID have not evolved that much. It is a highly contagious airborne disease. Tight-fitting masks are effective. Regular vaccinations are helpful in avoiding more serious illness and isolation. Some experts insist longer than 5 days is warranted to avoid getting other people sick. It can cause death and long-term or permanent disability. What has changed in the last 4 years is that it has become harder and harder for people to remain clear on this information and to put these basic guidelines into practice. The information about the risks of COVID and how to avoid them has gotten from mainstream advice to countercultural information that people have to search out. In this information-poor environment, the risk to disabled people, to those who work directly with the public, who are disproportionately BIPOC people, uh, and anyone else with an increased COVID risk level are dramatically increased. It is also now much harder to put this information into practice as government and institutional support for COVID safety practices has all but evaporated. Tools that we used earlier in the pandemic, like free testing, masks, and vaccines, have almost all been phased out, often shifting the financial burden for these to individual patients. The expectation to work while sick has been reimposed. The public has repeatedly been told, quote, we have the tools, unquote. But with tens of millions of people kicked off Medicaid in 2024, Paxlovid, a rapid treatment that reduces the risk of infection, is difficult to obtain for most people and expensive for almost everyone. Even the Bridge Access Program, which funded COVID vaccinations for those without private insurance to cover them, is sunsetting this fall. It is absolutely unaffordable to get COVID for the vast majority of working Americans. Absolutely unaffordable, I should say, to get COVID for the vast majority of working Americans. For people who are not working, who are retired and disabled on SSDI, on a limited income, or an SSI. This is a catastrophic cost to be exposed to right now, unquote. Beatrice Adler Bolton, co-author of Health Communism and co-host of the podcast, quote, Death Panel, unquote, told the truth out. One of the ways misleading information becomes normalized is by making it challenging for people to act on any other information. Quote, immunity debt and other commonly circulated myths, its disappearance of supports and these changes to the mainstream media narrative, it has become harder to feel sure about COVID. The dramatic wind down of data available has been coupled with a major shift in framing from the CDC, which is communicated in ways that fail to counter the U.S. public's widespread turn toward a mentality that is resonant with Trump's misleading push for, quote, herd immunity, unquote, in 2020. While the CDC does acknowledge that, quote, reinfection can occur as early as several weeks after previous infection, unquote, much of its recent messaging on COVID has tended to bolster the widespread public sense that hospitalization and COVID deaths have largely decreased because of immunity from prior infection or vaccinations. Only 28% of adults in the U.S. are up to date on COVID vaccinations. For example, the Pew Research Center cited the CDC in its statement that, quote, the vast majority of Americans have some level of protection from the coronavirus because of vaccination, prior infection, or a combination of the two. This has led to decline in severe illness from the disease, unquote. Adam Moore, a biologist working towards a PhD at the University of California, Davis, says, while this claim is accurate, the overall framing is, quote, dishonest, unquote, because it underemphasizes how quickly natural immunity can wane after a COVID infection. He also argues that this frame underemphasizes how COVID can have serious impacts on a person's immune system and their ability to fend off any kind of illness. Fundamentally, it is complicated to assess why fewer people are being hospitalized or dying of COVID despite continued high rates of circulation. The reason is not necessarily solely related to immunity through exposure or vaccination, especially given the disease's quick evolution that has resulted from the failure to contain it. The data collection on who has been hospitalized or even died with an active case of COVID has also become less reliable, as many hospitals no longer report all COVID cases, but instead make a distinction between people hospitalized, quote, with COVID, unquote, and people hospitalized, quote, for COVID, unquote. An undercounting of deaths has been a pattern throughout the pandemic. More importantly, experts who spoke the truth out emphasized that death and acute illness like hospitalization are the only serious outcomes from an illness. Most of us would like to avoid serious injury, traumatic events, and long term disability that fall outside the purview of the basic and extreme indicator of death. Pandemic indicators and figures that do not tell us how many people are developing or living with long COVID, for example, fall far short of offering a complete picture of the risk of COVID infection. The push for, quote, herd immunity, unquote, to COVID is only one of several common misleading ideas uh, ideas about immunity. Another is immunity debt, a claim that if a person has missed getting a cold or respiratory virus in 2021, they were more susceptible to getting sick in 2022. Immunity debt, although popularized in uh, some um, 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 some of the media outlets, is not a scientifically accepted idea. The immune system is not a, quote, muscle that needs exercise to get stronger, unquote, explained somebody by the name of Moore. I mean, don't think I mentioned that name before, or did I? No, I don't see a mention of Moore before. Oh, yes, Adam Moore, a virologist working towards a PhD of the University of California at Davis. So he was previously quoted, and now he is mentioned again. Moore highlights that this makes COVID wait a minute, I've gone too far. Oh, the immune system is not, quote, a muscle that needs exercise to get stronger. Okay, explain more. COVID goes against a lot of what people in the United States have been told about viruses and what has come to be common sense. The most common viruses in the US are seasonal, but COVID circulates year round, more like tropical viruses. More highlights. This makes COVID fundamentally different from the flu, and crucially, the vaccination cycle for the flu, where annual vaccination works because it accounts for the variants that have evolved in the opposite hemisphere. Since COVID circulates everywhere year round, annual vaccinations are not enough to keep up on the latest variants. By Beatrice Adler-Bogle, asked that COVID surges in the United States are not related to seasons, but rather to moments of intense travel, such as the Memorial Day weekend, the Labor Day weekend, the holidays in November and December, and spring break. Good information is available if you know where to look. The people who spoke the truth out for this story recommended many sources of robust, trustworthy information about COVID. These sources are not invested in making sure the economy continues going as it is, which has been one of the biggest reasons government and mainstream sources misrepresent COVID data. But many also have a commitment to disability and racial justice and are actively organizing for improved public health information and infrastructure. The recommended sources include NOHA, Abolada, and Roots Community Health's, quote, People's Health Updates on YouTube. Ground Truths, The newsletter of Eric Topol. The Sick Times, a weekly newsletter focusing on long COVID, and Adler Bolton's podcast, quote, Death Panel, unquote, which provides regular deep dives and analysis of COVID policy. Local mask blocks are another good source of information. These local mutual aid groups provide low cost of free masks to community members via bulk purchasing. And they share a lot of locally relevant information about COVID, often on Instagram. Nationally, groups like the People's CDC, the Public Health Collective, and the Pandemic Mitigation Collaborative, PMC, are synthesizing technical information and sharing it to a wider community with a disability justice lens. Hugh highlighted the importance of reading and combining a variety of information rather than relying on a single source. The most powerful part of COVID disinformation is its simple repetition through multiple channels constantly, says Adler Bolton. But repetition can work both ways. Those pushing for more accurate COVID information that allows everyday people to be in solidarity with one another can also use this power of repetition. But, quote, we have to be relentless, unquote. Undoing the bad information is difficult because, quote, breaking the mystification of disinformation, unquote, can't be done by simply changing the information that goes through those same particular media channels, said Adler Bolton. Instead, people must work with each other through personal connection. Quote, there is a kind of trust that we can build between each other that goes further than the trust any one person can have with any media project, no matter how good the project is, unquote. Information that rejects ableism and white supremacy raises the stakes by asking people to reject the comforts they have been promised by racial capitalism. Sharing that information with each other is part of a collective struggle for disability and racial justice. So I think that's a very interesting piece, in that it calls attention to a really, really, really severe problem, that the sources of information have been shut down, that it's harder to track cases now. This fits into a few remarks, I want to make. This article seems to recommend that vaccinations against COVID be frequent and try to keep up with the changes in the variants. He didn't explicitly say that, but it's implied by other things that he or she said in this article. Based on research that I have seen or heard about, it seems that the more vaccinations you have for COVID, the greater chance that you will get COVID again. Furthermore, I think information has surfaced, and I've seen this information, in many places. I have a good deal of trust in the doctors who are circulating this information, is that, first of all, there are preventatives that you can use to avoid COVID. One preventative is to take a lot of vitamin D3, supplemented, of course, with vitamin K2, to make sure that it goes to the bones. And additional magnesium also helps that process. But also, you supplement it with seaweed, either dried seaweed or seaweed salad. That combination is supposed to guard against all viruses, not simply COVID, according to a nursing PhD from the UK named John Campbell. Uh, John is a careful consumer and also sharer of research on COVID, okay, and other diseases, okay, as well. And he's not only a careful consumer, he's a careful disperser of information based on research, and always very much open to new research, okay, and to corrections. Okay, furthermore, uh, okay, there is a very uncomfortable situation now for people who look at overall deaths, okay, in the community. When you look at aggregate data, okay, on overall deaths, since the period of COVID and going forward, even to this period when it's claimed that the COVID emergency is over, there were excess deaths compared to baseline data from before COVID. And the excess deaths in various nations is substantial. It can range anywhere from, I've seen estimates of 8% in certain nations, up to as high as 18% in certain other nations. I forget the statistic for the United States. I believe it's somewhere in the low teens, but uh, there are many deaths here in the United States, okay, that exceed the averages uh, from times before COVID. The causes of these deaths, okay, are unaccounted for. Okay, we don't know whether some of these COVID cases, okay, that are unaccounted for, this is possible, okay, or whether this is due to other diseases that have appeared but that are not well studied, okay, or reported. All we know is we have this epidemic of excess deaths. John Campbell is another very good source for research on these excess deaths. So, uh, I don't agree with everything in this article in terms of the particulars, but I do agree that we need to have good and reliable information, okay, again, that our governments have left us behind, that they have abandoned us to COVID and long COVID. And this must change. I hope any future administrations will change that. Also, I should add that to some people, actually, Paxlovid is pretty well available. Uh, uh, a personal experience at Kaiser Permanente, uh, when you go in for routine things like perhaps sore throat or what appears to be, okay, a common cold, it is practice for the doctors to also administer, okay, a COVID test. And if you are positive for COVID, you get a Paxlovid treatment. And uh, if I recall correctly, there has not been a copay for that. So at least with respect to Kaiser Permanente, there is a health insurance / health care organization that is taking care to minimize the impact of COVID, okay, on its patients. Of course, they're also careful to recommend vaccinations. We have not been taking our vaccinations of late because we've seen and believe, okay, the research uh, that says basically the more vaccinations you take, the more likely it is that you're going to get COVID again. And it also has been our experience, I have to add, that in the I guess it must be a year and a half now. Um, since we last experienced the COVID, both Bonnie, Kay, and I, uh, we have not taken, any more vaccinations. But we have used vitamin D3 too that I talked about. Okay, and also the combination of that with um, um, seaweed. We take high concentrations, of vitamin D. This is not a recommendation to others. We're not qualified, of course, to recommend anything, but what we're outlining here is the experience of myself, and my wife, strictly personal experience that I am sharing. Uh, I recently went in for a sore throat, and I was tested for COVID then. Okay, it was negative. My sore throat has been treated, with other means. Uh, it is much improved. Uh, I still do have a sore tongue, but the latest treatment I've gotten, I'm happy to report, seems to be working. So, I wanted to go to our last piece for the day. Before I go to that, I guess I'm going to look at some comments. Okay, there are hellos, all around. Steve Day says, dump the corruption 2024. Yes, but I'm afraid we're going to need also dump the corruption 2025 and 2026 and 2027 and 2028 before we're through. Litmus test it is. Evelina says, wondering if there's a list of those who do not take big pack money. I guess I answered that already. Sandy Degg says, now there is an outbreak of monkeypox. Hi, Sandy. Always great to see you here. Sandy says it's not here yet. Steve Wolfbrand said the vaccines didn't work. Sandy says they just want us to keep taking those shots. Do we really need more COVID shots? I had my shots and I haven't had COVID yet. Well, we had our shots. We had the first 3 shots, or was it 4? I forget. We were faithful about that. And we got COVID after we took our last set of shots. A few months later, we got COVID. These were mild cases that we had. We stayed indoors, and Bonnie got Paxlovid treatment. Mine was diagnosed too late, to get the Paxlovid treatment, but fortunately it was a mild case. Bonnie's was mild also, and she had the Paxlovid. The treatment was successful, but after that, for reasons I mentioned and the research that we saw, we felt there was no need to take any more shots. We work on prevention. That is what we do. But again, this is not advice for anyone. We are not qualified, to give advice. I am not one of those kinds of doctors. I'm a political science PhD. So there it is. Okay, moving to the last of our pieces tonight. Why we must oppose Israel's dangerous gamble before it's too late. I picked this up at Portside. It was originally published at The Progressive. The tagline is, a failure to stop Israel's genocide of Palestinians gambles with the fate of humanity as a whole. Of course, we're seeing that right now. We're all waiting on tenterhooks to see the retaliation which the axis of resistance is going to bring to Israel, and see whether there's further retaliation, uh, and see whether the escalation ladder basically gets stopped at that point, or whether we continue to escalate and escalate, okay, and escalate until nuclear weapons are used. Anyway, this graphic from Roots Action says, tell the General Assembly to use, quote, uniting for peace, unquote, to uphold the rule of law in Palestine, where the UN Security Council has failed. Yes, good idea. This is from World Beyond War. Following World War II, Albert Camus posed a, quote, formidable gamble to those who had survived the tragedy of immense proportions. Quote, we're in history up to our necks, unquote, he observed, yet we must wager that, quote, words are more powerful than ammunition, okay, unquote. Quote, leave or die are the horrid words threatening largely unprotected Palestinian civilians in Gaza, as dismayed populations around the world demand moral decency, or at least some indication of sanity from their non-responsive governments. The stakes couldn't be higher. For decades, Israel has flouted international norms by refusing to acknowledge its nuclear weapons arsenal, which, by the way, is estimated at roughly 200 nuclear warheads. Nor has it signed the relevant treaties governing the biological weapons it possesses. For years, Israel has flagrantly violated the Geneva Conventions and basic principles of customary international law through its forcible acquisition of territories in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and through its transfer of Israeli settlers into the occupied Palestinian territories. So far, this is all absolutely accurate. Now, Israel's genocidal attacks against Palestinians living in Gaza have cost the lives of at least 39,677. Well, strictly speaking, I'm sure that's correct, at least 39,677. But I think the statement is incomplete without including the information that the Lancet, a very well-respected publication, has recently estimated that the amount of deaths that have likely occurred in Gaza are at least 186,000. I think that should have been added as a phrase to this. Tens of thousands more are believed to be buried beneath the rubble, with at least 90,000 wounded, and the overwhelming majority of its displaced 1.9 million population facing starvation. Israel's failure to comply with international treaties and humanitarian law signal an acute need for other countries to organize weapons embargoes, cease trade deals, and provide support for civilian peacekeepers to bring about a permanent ceasefire. Instead of unwavering adherence to international law, the United States continues to arm and protect Israel's genocidal campaign against Palestinians, which now includes using starvation as a weapon of war. We must try to absorb what it means to live as a refugee in an open-air concentration camp, already one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, even before 70% of its housing was destroyed. More than 341 mosques and 3 churches have been destroyed. 2,000-pound bombs have been dropped on tents in places deemed safe areas. Innocent civilians are being killed by snipers. 31 out of 36 hospitals have been damaged or destroyed. Escape routes are cut off. persistent restrictions on the flow of humanitarian aid into and around Gaza are driving a desperate shortage of food, fuel, and medicine. Its access to humanitarian relief is deliberately choked off. Children are being collectively punished while Israeli leaders denounce them as animals. The world watches in horror as surgeons are forced to amputate the limbs of wounded children with no available anesthetics. A new polio epidemic emerges while Israel vaccinates its soldiers, but leaves the Palestinian civilian population vulnerable. Newly released prisoners have said they were subject to torture, including being waterboarded and raped. Rather than bring suspects before international courts, Israel has resorted to assassinations of the very negotiators with whom it purports to be seeking peace, and in a manner clearly intended to expand the conflict into a global war involving multiple nuclear-armed nations. In its July 19th, 2024, authoritative advisory opinion on Israel's settlement policy and practices, the World Court clearly declared the Israeli settlement project in the occupied territories to be illegal. The court outlined the obligation of all parties to the Geneva Convention and the Genocide Convention to discontinue any economic or trade dealings with Israel, which might help perpetuate Israel's occupation and unlawful presence in the territory. Countries that signed or ratified these agreements are obligated to immediately stop arms exports to Israel and to use political, military, and economic influence to stop Israel's flagrant, escalating violations of international humanitarian law. The World Court has provided strong, clear words denouncing Israel's genocide against Palestinians. As during the Vietnam War, ordinary citizens can no longer abide with the lawless barbarism of continuing assaults against Palestinians. Quote, rolling the bones, unquote, is a slang expression for gambling. With the regional war perhaps now unavoidable in the Middle East, the genocidal derangement of the United States and Europe over Israel's actions may well lead to a nuclear war that ends the human species. Failing to use our words at this most critical juncture for humanity would be, as Camus said, a formidable gamble, indeed. Kathy Kelly is a peace activist, pacifist, and author. She is one of the founding members of Voices in the Wilderness and currently a coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, a campaign to end the U.S. military and economic warfare. So, I strongly agree with this piece. Of course, I think it's extremely well written. I think it calls on all of us to comply with the Genocide Convention and to comply with the Geneva Convention. Certainly all of us here in the United States to comply with that, because those conventions are the law of this land. And the Geneva Convention, is that's a convention which Israel itself is actually subject to. But from the standpoint of domestic law in this country, these conventions are the law of the land. They are international treaties to which we have subscribed. That means they rank more highly than domestic law here. So why is it we cannot get the United States government to comply with our domestic laws and stop shipping arms to Israel? These shipments are violations of the law of our land, and they need to stop. I'll check to see if you have any further comments. Sandy Dick says, I'm glad you were both good. Sandy says, it's horrible. Yes. Okay, it is horrible. On that note, I'm going to call it a night for tonight. Say goodnight here. I'll be moving over to D show, which began at 9 p.m. I'm only 7 minutes over, okay, at this point. I do want to say I'll be back again on Saturday night. For the time being, I am down to 3 shows a week on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights because I need more time during the day and during the week to take care of essential business that I have to rely on. Sandy says, have a great night. Everyone, thank you, Sandy, and thank you for being here. Okay. And also thank all of you for being here. Attendance was pretty good tonight. Okay, I always like that. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve Day. And thank you, Dee. And Evelina. Thank you, Evelina, too. Steve Day says, Steve Wolfbrand says, vaccines didn't work. Yeah, I think that too, as well. Evelina says, thank you. So I'll see you again, hopefully, on Saturday night. I don't know whether I'll be going on at 8 or 9 on Saturday night. Depends on whether Dee has a show. If she has a show, then I'll be going on at 8. Otherwise, I'll be going on at 9. Thank you very much for coming again, and good night.